Hello, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm Heath Jones. I'm your host and the pastor of Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, after which this podcast is named. This podcast is recorded by me here in the church, usually about what I plan to talk about in the coming week. Get a little practice, but then also it's good for those who might want to listen to a podcast rather than sit through some sort of speech. So here we are. But before I move on to other housekeeping issues, I should let you know that the sun is shining outside. In fact, I can hear birds as we speak. And so children are playing right outside of my office, which I like to hear. But if it's a distraction to you, I'm sorry. Today, there's nothing that can be done. It's midweek on a school day, and children will play when the weather's nice. And, why shouldn't they? However, if you're wanting to come by on another day, or maybe come by and see us today. But if you're wanting to come by on a Sunday and see what happens at Northwood, you're welcome to come by. Our usual worship service is at 10:45. We are an open and affirming church. All are welcome, whatever sexual orientation or race. And we mean that. Or if you'd like, you could do your research first to check out if we're on the level. Our website is www.indyncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. And there you can find past sermons and Bible studies, as well as a variety of other information about our tenants, our events, etc. So you might want to check that out or reach directly to me. If you just have a question you might want to ask or a comment about this podcast or anything else, you can do so directly at my email, which is Heath, my name, Heath, at indyncc.org. And before we move past these housekeeping issues, I'd like to recognize the All Indiana Podcast Network for producing this podcast. That's the All Indiana Podcast Network. And they produce and distribute a variety of podcasts made by people in Indiana and often about topics of interest to us, though not necessarily or exclusively. So whether you live in state or out, you should check these out. And the easiest way you can find them, I think, is www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. Moving on. Here in a moment, we'll be going over a Bible passage where Jesus uses a powerful metaphor, or at least one that sticks out, to help us better understand his call into our lives, his voice, to listen for what he would have us do. But first, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience, and if this means you, I'll catch you after these ads. And we're back. And as I was saying, we'll be going over a passage from the Bible, specifically from the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. That's the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, which I will just now read. Verily, truly, I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again, Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes by only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. The Bible is rich in metaphors meant to describe what it is like to enter into the realm of God. This is just one of them. One of those word pictures meant to help us see what it might be like to fall deeper into a life that is patterned after God's ways for us. And this parable is no exception. We have a very common one, really, from the onset. It's used time and time again, the metaphor of sheep and shepherd, meant to describe the nature of God's love and care for us. It's not the only place in the scriptures. And the shepherd-sheep metaphor is meant to teach us about the intimate ways in which God gathers us, knows us. I don't know if you missed that detail, knows us by name and leads us to peaceful places. Jesus, as shepherd, knows our patterns and what we need to thrive. So the good shepherd calls us with his voice to a place where we can live well. And the sheep respond to his voice, a voice that they've come to trust. Now, the next metaphor I notice is that of voice, hearing the voice, responding to the voice. In a world that is very loud with voices clamoring for our attention, disciples of Jesus can pick out the voice of Christ in the den. We're supposed to be able to hear the difference between his voice and all those others. Perhaps you've heard it at church, or perhaps you caught whispers of it by way of the loving actions of another. Either way, when you hear it, God's voice, you want to lean in toward it, to gravitate towards people, places, stories that remind you of the love of God, the love of Jesus, the voice of God. And those that hear this voice are like sheep who know their shepherd's voice. Their eyes could be closed, they could be blind, they would know it. It can be subtle and sometimes loud. But we are here in this space because I'm guessing we each, in our own way, have heard the call of Jesus through the competing noises outside, compelling us to be richer, or more famous, or whatever. And Jesus calls us to a richer life and a greater love. I like that a lot. But one gate that grabs me also is gate. One metaphor, rather, that grabs me is gate, that of gate, or gatekeeper, guarding the life inside the fold. I should pause to note how this metaphor, this describing Jesus as the gatekeeper, has been weaponized over the years. This gate metaphor has been described by preachers as this very narrow crack in the wall meant to keep people on the other side of heaven and us safe inside. In fact, to keep people in the place judgmental people have assumed they belong, the gate keeps them in hell. And the gatekeeper's function in this paradigm has been described as more of a bouncer, in my opinion, keeping people outside of the God Club, a club whose membership the elect pride themselves at obtaining. All this to say, I can understand why a preacher would want to focus on the universality of God's love and maybe shy away from words like these. But it's my hope in the coming moments that I might reframe things for you so that you can come to a better understanding of what this text is really about. Because its goal is to help us follow Jesus' call toward a life-giving way. Its purpose is not to scare or keep others outside, but rather to invite others in, but admittedly acknowledging that the way to love can be hard. But what is this life-giving way that I've been talking about, the way to love that Jesus describes? And I'd like to spend a few moments on that question specifically so you know what I'm talking about. And I'll just stick with the Gospel of John, just so we're consistent with today's text. And in John's Gospel, the way Jesus shows us the way is that it's a way anchored in God's love, John 3:16. We read in John 8 where it's a way anchored in the truth, where Jesus says the truth will set us free. We read also in John 8 how it's a way anchored in grace, where there's a woman in that story, in that chapter, caught in adultery, and Jesus advocates for her and asks for grace for her. But really, it's this way that leads towards the restoration of all persons, who were left outside of life-giving community. Think in that day, Jesus' day, tax collectors, lepers, sinners, and others who were thought to be unclean or outside of God's love. So to summarize the way of Jesus here, if I'm losing you in the noise, the shepherd Jesus speaks through the din and the noise of our times to call us to a greater love for one another, God's creation, everything. The shepherd Jesus calls us to a greater truth about ourselves, in all of our flaws, and about what is most important, and the truth about those who commit injustices. And the shepherd leads us, Jesus calls us to the path of grace where we find ourselves accepted, warts and all. And lastly, the shepherd, Jesus, leads us to a place where outcasts find their place in the world. All this to say, the place Jesus wants to lead us is the sort of place where a loving community is possible. Possible because the ways that lead to death and division have been rejected in light of a better way. And the voices that call us towards those ways of death have been drowned out by the voice that leads to life. So Jesus taught about this way, and he embodied, meaning he lived into, by his actions and words, this way. He instructed others on how to love and how to care for one another. He showed his followers what it looks like to forgive one's enemies. He did that more than once. And to advocate for the dignity of all persons. This is the way that Jesus is described in contrast with the other ways that were being practiced all around the disciples in his day. And the gate that we are instructed to walk through is the door that leads to health and well-being. It's the path to a community that is built around the values of Jesus, over and against the status quo. Narrow, hard, but it's the way of love. I've spoken many times on this before, but here's a brief description of the status quo in Jesus' day. If you've heard me talk about it before, just plug your ears, but Rome ruled the roost in that day. Israel was occupied by Rome. They were a colony of Rome, and the people were taxed highly and in deep poverty, and the Roman army kept the people in line by violent means, and the people were very oppressed. But Rome seemed to hold as its value peace, for Romans, but at the expense of others. Rome had wealth for us and on the backs of others, and some people made off very well if they were able to collude with Rome in their pillaging, but most were left outside of the wealth with no access to the resources they needed to live well. Also, there came with this a Roman system of what we'll call an imperial theology, naming Caesar or their god king as the son of God or a literal divine being. The power of Rome was a gift of the heavens, it was thought, and Caesar's image was printed on the currency, an ancient rendition of the idea of in God, or in this case Caesar, we trust. So you have Jesus and his voice calling us to the way of love, and then you have, in Jesus' day, Rome and its voice, and what you have is it calling you away from love and towards values of an empire built by greed and on the backs of the poor and the surrounding nations. You have here an empire and a voice that is calling the people towards its perpetual existence by way of perpetual war and looting. You not only have greed and violence, but the greed and violence is sanctioned by a nationalist religion that gives the practices of Rome a divine sanction. God wills this. People were required to make sacrifices to the cult of the emperor on a yearly basis. And that day's that would be that day's version of paying homage to the national identity and its symbols. Rome's voice, in light of all I'm saying, it was the loudest and most persistent, dominant, seemed the strongest, calling all peoples to worship idols. Then you have Jesus calling to those who would listen. There is another way. There is a way marked by peace, love, justice, grace, and truth-telling. You know those thieves who are trying to arrive at heaven by violence and pillage, says Jesus, who are trying to set themselves up well, climbing over the wall. They are like thieves trying to climb the fence and enter into a peace and a joy and a love that they can only find by entering the way of Jesus, the way of love, the way of peace, the way that rejects the death-dealing ways of empire. Jesus speaks into a world of loud voices to those whose ears are specially tuned to hear what he has to say. And those who hear it follow. They enter into the joy of the God who called them into existence, gave them a name, and knows them intimately. In Jesus' time, this meant that disciples should stop listening to the voice of Rome, its false gods of greed and oppression, and start listening to the voice that called them towards life-giving ways. Now, this would upset powerful people of Jesus' day so much that they killed him. He upset the apple cart that much, and many others have died through the centuries. Along the way, we call them saints and martyrs. But those who hear the call of the shepherd continue to follow, undaunted, undistracted, and this is true today. We can still hear the voice and enter into the gate that leads to a better place. And the door, guess what, is wide open. Jesus receives all with open arms, as love does. But there are many voices trying to command our attention even today. In Jesus' time, the dominant voice was Rome's. In our consumer culture, we are told that our identity is tied up in our vocations, our jobs, what we do to serve corporations most often, or in our ability to accrue wealth, in our titles, our names, jobs, stuff like that, or in our national identity. It's like we're asked to wear so many name tags, mass-produced, meant to give us our identity, prescribed for us in a way. And we are told that if we play the game, we will find our way inside the fence. Inside the fence, we are told that is safe and secure, where we'll be fed and cared for. This safety made possible by military force, the wealth made possible by rampant consumption and the exploitation of underpaid workers and the exploitation of our planet, its degradation. And if you just pluck away at things long enough, you'll be safe inside the fence, they say. And the gate, we keep thinking we can make it on our own. In the meantime, look around you. Have the promises of these voices borne out? Have they been found to be true? Those that have brought us mass incarceration, deeper pockets of poverty, and deepening a more vulnerable middle class and ever shrinking. And all of this was true before that pandemic and before these wars that have us locked in rapt attention. Shows the fragility of the system laid bare. I think we are seeing what it is like in real time, that there are no shortcuts to peace. There is no way to climb over the gate. We cannot enter, we will not find a better gate or will it into existence. Before we arrive at peace, we'll need to reject the allures of wealth and consumerism that have us in their grasp and all other idols our cultures create, the fetishizing of violence, all of it. You cannot by way of robbery or thievery enter into the peace of God. By way of violence. You must enter by the way Jesus described, which I'll remind you is the way of love, grace, peace. One that strives to restore all persons or include all persons to life-giving communion with one another. And this way is only made possible by way of love and hard truth-telling, which is what should always be what we're trying to do. So the question for us today, 2,000 years later, is whose voice will we hear in these trying times? The voices that have led us again and again to tenuous, stressful living? The greedy voices that brought you mass layoffs, the whole while turned your heart into a consumer's heart and ruined our planet? The voices that sanctioned the torture in black sites all over the globe of people who were not even charged with crimes, or drone strikes on civilians, all in the name of peace? Have their promises been found to be true? Decades and decades later, have their promises been found to be true? And here we are. And I think that they are, in the words of Jesus, like thieves who seek to kill and destroy or jump over the wall and short-circuit peace in their attempt to find the shortcut to peace. So for us, it's listen. We must listen, hear the voice competing with the loud, blithering voices of our times, Jesus calling you home. His way led to a cross, true, but in so doing confronted the death-dealing ways of our world and revealed that life wins in the end, again and again. And if you believe this to be true, listen to his voice, calling us towards a love that transcends borders, nationalities, races, language, a voice that calls us away from greed and toward abundance and on the other side of generosity, abundance after we have been generous, and then some. And there is a gate, a path, a door to these things that Jesus is the embodiment of. And Jesus is that way. His way, the way of love. It isn't a door that keeps you out. It is a path that you walk along. Will you hear the voice? Will you tune out the loud mouths of your television or in print media or in certain high political offices? Hear the one who said, I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I, says Jesus, came that they may have life and have it abundantly. It's time for persons of all walks of life to hear this call and follow it to the life it leads us to. God is faithful and will make good on these promises. Jesus is the way for us, his ways and his values, those who hear the call that will follow. He is the gate, but this is not a door that excludes, but rather welcomes us all into a better way, a better perspective. So enter into the fold if you haven't yet, but use the gate. No shortcuts, but the way of love. But the gate is always open. God is calling humanity to a better way. It's time for us to hear the voice and enter into the life humanity was always meant to live.